The wind on the high plains has a voice, a low, mournful sound that scours the land and seeps through the chinks in the walls of their small cabin. To Alara, it sounds like loneliness itself. She pulls her worn shawl tighter, her eyes fixed on the tiny, trembling creature in the straw-filled crate she's hidden in the darkest corner of the barn. It's a calf, no bigger than a large dog, with bones that jut out like the ribs of a wrecked boat and a coat of dull, patchy brown. Its breath is a fragile mist in the cold air, a tiny signal of a life that refuses to be extinguished. She dips her finger into the small bowl of precious goat's milk and brings it to the calf's mouth. The small, rough tongue rasps against her skin, a desperate, weak pull that clutches at her heart. This secret, this tiny, breathing secret, is the most dangerous thing she has ever done. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. She knows the brand. Even caked with dirt, the sharp, angular bee seared into the calf's hide is unmistakable. It's the mark of Silas Blackwood, the cattle baron who owns half the territory and holds the other half in a grip of fear and economic might. His herds are a force of nature, moving across the plains like a biblical plague, leaving trampled earth and the dust of their passage in their wake. His foremen are known for their brutal efficiency. An animal too weak to keep up with the drive is an animal left to the coyotes and the vultures. It is a simple, cruel calculus of the frontier. To interfere is not just foolish, it's an accusation of theft. And in this land, a rustler's life is worth less than the hide of the animal they stole. Her husband, Caleb, would be horrified. He is a man who walks a narrow path of grim determination, his shoulders perpetually stooped with the weight of their failing homestead. They cannot afford another mouth to feed, especially one that belongs to the one man you did not cross. She knew the brand on its hide meant certain death for the calf and unimaginable trouble for them all. But as she watched the tiny creature shiver and fight for one more breath, she knew she couldn't let it die alone. Caleb had married her a month after the ground had settled over her parents' graves. The diphtheria had taken them both within a week, leaving Alara with nothing but a mortgaged plot of dust and the clothes on her back. He had come calling not with flowers or promises, but with a proposition as stark and practical as the landscape itself. He needed a wife, a helpmate. His own small ranch, clinging to the edge of Blackwood's vast empire, was too much for one man. He was 30, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a silence that seemed to have been carved into him by years of solitude and hardship. Alara had accepted. It was not a choice made of love or even hope, but of survival. The alternative was a grim slide into destitution or charity, and her pride was the last thing her parents had left her. So she had packed her mother's Bible and her father's whetstone into a small trunk and had ridden beside Caleb and his buckboard to the small, clapboard cabin that was now her home. The cabin was clean but sparse, stripped of anything that wasn't essential. 2 rooms, a stone hearth, a bed with a faded quilt, and a window that looked out onto a seemingly endless expanse of brown grass and bruised purple sky. Caleb was not an unkind man, but he was a closed one. Words were a currency he spent sparingly. Their days were measured by the sun and the work. He'd rise before dawn, his movements economical and quiet, and be out mending fences or tending to their small herd of bony cattle before she had the fire properly stoked. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, she tended the meager garden that fought a losing battle against the wind and the lack of rain. They moved around each other in a carefully choreographed dance of necessity, their conversations limited to the weather, the price of feed, the state of the fences. In the evenings, they would sit at the small, rough-hewn table, the silence between them as vast and empty as the plains outside. He would clean his rifle or repair a piece of tack, his hands sure and steady. She would darn his socks, her needle a tiny glinting star in the lamplight. She learned the landscape of his silence, the tight set of his jaw that meant worry, the slight softening around his eyes that passed for contentment, The way he'd stare out the window for long stretches, lost in a place she couldn't follow. She knew he carried the weight of his father's dreams for this land, a legacy that was turning to dust in his hands. He was a good man trapped in a hard life. Her own grief was a private country she visited in the dead of night, her tears silent so as not to disturb him. She missed the easy laughter of her own home, the scent of her mother's baking, the solid presence of her father. Here, she felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life, a functional component in the machinery of survival, not a partner, not a wife, in any true sense of the word. The shadow of Silas Blackwood was everywhere. His land began where theirs ended, a border marked by a sturdy, well-maintained fence that made their own sagging wires look pathetic. His cattle, sleek and fat, sometimes grazed right up to the line, a stark reminder of their own poverty. When Caleb went to the small settlement of dusty buildings they called a town, he would return with his silence drawn even tighter around him. She knew, from snippets of overheard conversation, that the townsfolk walked on eggshells around Blackwood and his interests. The store owner, Mr. Abernathy, who measured out their flour and beans with a grudging air, owed his business to Blackwood's patronage. The sheriff wore a badge, but it was common knowledge that Blackwood's law was the one that truly mattered. Once, Caleb came back from town, his face a grim mask. He'd tried to buy seed on credit and had been refused. Abernathy had glanced nervously toward the saloon where two of Blackwood's foremen were drinking. "Can't do it, Caleb," he'd muttered, not meeting his eyes. "Times are tight." It was a lie. Times were tight for them, not for a man who served the Blackwood Empire. Caleb had said nothing of it to her, but she saw the fresh layer of defeat settle on him, another stone on an already burdened back. They were small, insignificant, and isolated, living on the crumbs of a world owned by another man. The vastness of the land, which should have felt like freedom, instead felt like a cage, and Silas Blackwood held the key. It was into this silent, strained world that the calf had appeared. One of Blackwood's massive herds had passed by 2 days prior, a river of horns and hide that took half a day to move past their southern fence line. The ground was churned to a powder. The next morning, Alara had taken a spool of wire to repair a section that had been trampled down. That's when she'd found it, huddled in a shallow ditch, left behind. It was so still she thought it was already dead. But when she touched its flank, a tremor ran through its emaciated frame. Its eyes, huge and dark and filmy with despair, had opened and looked at her. Something inside her, something that had been dormant and frozen for months, had broken open. It was the helplessness, the utter solitude of the creature. It was a reflection of her own heart. Looking at that abandoned animal, she felt a surge of defiance, so fierce it stole her breath. Blackwood and his empire could have the plains, the cattle, the town. They could not have this one small life. Not if she could help it. She had half carried, half dragged it back, her muscles screaming in protest. She'd hidden it in the old and used milking stall at the far end of the barn, praying Caleb wouldn't have a reason to go there. The risk was a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time since her arrival, she had a purpose that was entirely her own. She named it Button for its small, dark nose that looked just like a polished shoe button. And in the quiet moments she spent nursing it, whispering words of encouragement, she felt a flicker of the person she used to be. The first test came 2 days later. At supper, Caleb set down his cup of goat's milk, his brow furrowed. "The nanny's running low," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "Hope she isn't sickening." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her eyes on her plate, her hands clenched in her lap. Perhaps the dry grass isn't suiting her. He looked at her, his gaze steady and searching. He was a man who noticed everything. The way a fence post leaned, the shift in the wind, the tracks of a coyote near the chicken coop. He had to have noticed the change in her, the furtive trips to the barn, the way her shawl sometimes smelled of milk and straw. He knew. She was sure of it. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. She braced herself for the anger, for the practical, unassailable logic that they could not afford this folly. He picked up his fork and resumed eating. Maybe, he said, and that was all. He did not press the issue. He did not demand an explanation. In his silence, he had given her a gift, the space to keep her secret. But it was a strained and fragile piece. He had let it go for now, but the calf was a ticking clock in the corner of their lives, and they both knew that sooner or later, time would run out. The days that followed settled into a new, clandestine rhythm. Alara lived a double life. In the cabin, she was Caleb's quiet, dutiful wife. In the barn, she was a fierce and tender protector. Button, under her constant care, began to transform. The hopeless film in his eyes cleared, replaced by a curious spark. His legs, once as wobbly as fresh-spun thread, grew stronger. He would greet her with a weak but eager bleat, nudging his head against her hand. His coat started to fill in, losing its dull, deathly cast. Each small improvement was a victory she savored in secret. Caleb never spoke of it, but his complicity became an unspoken thread between them. One morning, she found a small pile of sweet hay, better than their usual stock, pushed into the corner of the barn near Button's stall. It was the kind Caleb saved for their mare, their most valuable animal. He had left it there without a word, a silent offering. Another evening, he came in from his chores and set a bucket down by the door. "Found an extra one," he said gruffly, not looking at her. No use for it. It was a milking bucket, smaller and easier to handle than the one she'd been surreptitiously using. These quiet gestures were more eloquent than any speech. They were acknowledgments, permissions. He was in this with her, whether he approved or not. His protection had extended from her to her cause. The realization warmed something deep inside Alara. She started watching him differently, seeing past the weary pragmatist to the man underneath. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be gentle as he reset a chick's broken leg. She noticed the lines of exhaustion around his eyes and began leaving a tin of hot coffee on the porch for him in the afternoons. She took more care with their meals, trying to make the meager fare more palatable. One afternoon, as she was kneading bread, he came to stand in the doorway, just watching her. His presence was so still, she didn't notice him at first. When she did, she faltered, a blush rising on her cheeks. "My mother used to do that," he said, his voice softer than she was used to. Said she was putting her thoughts into the dough. "What did she think about?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "Mostly about how stubborn my father was. And how much it was going to rain," he paused. "You have good hands for it. Strong." It was the first compliment he had ever given her. It was simple, unadorned, but it landed in her heart like a welcome stone in a rippling pool. The air in the cabin shifted, becoming less a shared space of necessity and more a shared silence of possibility. That evening, when they sat at the table, the quiet felt less empty, more companionable. They were partners in a secret, and it was forging a bond between them stronger than any vow spoken before a preacher. The small world they were building was fragile, however, and the outside world pressed in. A week after she found Button, a rider appeared on the horizon. He was not just passing by. He was heading directly for their cabin. Alara's blood ran cold. It was one of Blackwood's men. She recognized the confident, easy way he sat his horse, the proprietary air of a man who owned the ground he rode on. Caleb met him on the porch. Alara watched through the window, her hands twisting in her apron. The man was lean and hawk-faced, with eyes that swept over their small, struggling homestead with unconcealed disdain. He introduced himself as Jed, a foreman for the Blackwood Ranch. "Just checking the lines," Jed said, his voice carrying on the still air. "We lost a few stragglers in the last drive. Mr. Blackwood likes his counts to be tidy. You folks haven't seen a stray calf, have you? Brown, scrawny thing. Branded, of course." Alara held her breath. The description was exact. Caleb's stance was deceptively relaxed, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Can't say that we have," he replied, his voice level. "Lot of country out here for a calf to get lost in." Jed's eyes narrowed, lingering for a moment on the barn. "True enough, but they usually turn up, or something does." The veiled threat hung in the air. "Mr. Blackwood pays a finder's fee." and he deals harshly with anyone who might be tempted to appropriate his property. He gave a thin, humorless smile, touched the brim of his hat, and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and dread. When Caleb came back inside, his face was like stone. The fragile peace of the last week was shattered. The danger was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name and a face. It was Jed, and behind him, the immense, faceless power of Silas Blackwood. That night, sleep eluded Alara. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to be the figure of a man. The calf, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a millstone that could drag them both down. She felt a wave of guilt. She had brought this danger to their door, to this man who already had more burdens than he could bear. She slipped out of bed and went to the window, staring out at the moon-bleached plains. The door creaked behind her. Caleb was standing there, a silhouette against the faint light from the hearth's embers. "He won't find it," Caleb said quietly. It wasn't a question. He looked at the barn. She whispered, her voice thick with fear. "He knows." Caleb came to stand beside her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a comfort. Jed knows how to make a man sweat. It's what he's paid for. He was silent for a long moment. "When I was a boy, my father had a dispute with Blackwood over water rights, a small stream that bordered our lands. Blackwood's men diverted it, just took it. There was nothing my father could do. It broke something in him. He had never spoken of his father before. The confidence was a startling intimacy. I won't let that happen to us," he continued, his voice a low, fierce rumble. "I won't let him break what we have here." She didn't know what he meant by what we have here, this marriage of convenience, this failing ranch. But looking at his determined profile in the moonlight, she felt a surge of loyalty so powerful it surprised her. He wasn't just talking about the land. He was talking about them, about the home they were hesitantly, silently building. She turned to him. "Caleb, we could take it back. We can leave it somewhere for them to find." "No," he said, and his voice was absolute. He finally looked at her, and in the dim light, she saw an emotion in his eyes she had never seen before, a raw, fierce protectiveness. "He suspects. If we return the calf now, it will look like guilt. It will prove his suspicions. We're past that point." He reached out, his rough fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, but it sent a jolt through her. "You saved it, Alara. You did a good thing. I won't let you be punished for it." It was the first time he had spoken her name with such tenderness. In that moment, standing in the dark heart of their simple cabin, the nature of their contract changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about allegiance. He was choosing her and her impulsive, dangerous act of kindness over caution, over safety, over the sensible path. He was choosing to stand with her against the shadow of Silas Blackwood. And as he let his hand fall away, Alara knew she was no longer just a bride of convenience. She was Caleb's wife, and this was their fight. The foreman's visit changed the air. The secret of Button was no longer a quiet act of defiance, but a heavy, dangerous liability. Every creak of the cabin floor, every distant coyote howl, sent a fresh spike of anxiety through Alara. Caleb, too, was changed. The weary resignation in his posture was replaced by a watchful tension. He spent more time near the cabin, his rifle never far from his hand, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The unspoken thing between them was no longer just the calf. It was the shared understanding of their peril. This new, sharp-edged reality paradoxically drew them closer. Their sparse conversations began to deepen. He would ask about her family's farm, and she would tell him stories of her father's skill with horses, of the apple orchard her mother had nurtured from saplings. He listened with an intensity that made her feel seen, valued. In return, he shared small pieces of his own past, stories of learning to track from a traveling Cheyenne elder, of the brutal winter that took most of his father's herd years ago. They were trading pieces of themselves, building a bridge of shared history across the silent chasm that had once separated them. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the wind rattling the window pane, he found her in the barn, gently rubbing Button's back as the little calf contentedly drank a precious bowl of milk. The animal was thriving. Its legs were sturdy, its coat had a healthy sheen, and it followed Alara with a devotion that was absolute. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching them for a long moment before speaking. "You have a gift with animals," he said. It was a simple observation, but it held the weight of deep respect. "Better than me. I have the patience for fences, not for gentling." "My father always said you don't gentle an animal with your hands," she replied softly, not looking up. "You gentle it with your heart. They know if you mean them harm or harbor fear." "And you have no fear of this one?" he asked, his gaze knowing. She finally met his eyes. "Not of him, of what he represents." "He represents a risk," Caleb said, his voice flat. "But he also represents, well, he's the best-looking thing on this ranch right now." A small, surprised laugh escaped Alara's lips. It was the first time she had truly laughed in his presence, and the sound seemed to startle them both. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, softening the harsh lines and making him look younger. In that shared moment of levity, the heavy weight of their situation lifted just for a moment. He pushed himself off the doorframe and came closer. He reached down, not to touch her, but to run a hand along Button's strong back. The calf didn't flinch. "He's strong," Caleb admitted. "You've done well by him, Alara." The storm broke then, the rain coming down in a torrent, drumming a deafening rhythm on the barn roof. It enclosed them in a small, loud world of their own, the fury of nature outside sealing them within the sense of hay, milk, and rain-soaked earth. The tension between them was no longer one of fear, but of a different, more potent energy. It was the awareness of their proximity, of the bond that had grown in the shadow of danger. He was standing so close she could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair and smell the scent of damp wool and clean soil that clung to him. He was her husband. The thought, which had once felt like a legal definition, now felt like a physical reality, a pull as strong and undeniable as gravity. He seemed to feel it too, for his hand dropped from the calf and his gaze locked with hers, a question in his deep-set eyes. The world outside roared, but in the heart of the storm, in the small, protected space of the barn, there was a profound and transformative quiet. The moment was broken by a sudden, frantic clucking from the direction of the chicken coop. It was the sharp, panicked sound of a predator. Instantly, Caleb's demeanor shifted back to the vigilant protector. He grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the wall and was out the door in a flash, disappearing into the driving rain. Alara, her heart pounding for a different reason now, secured Button in his stall and rushed after him. By the time she reached the coop, Caleb had a large coyote cornered against the wire fence. It was snarling, its fur slick with rain, its eyes glowing yellow in the dim light. Caleb stood firm, the pitchfork held like a spear. He wasn't trying to kill it, she realized. He was just holding it at bay, his presence a solid, unmovable wall protecting their livestock. With a final, frustrated snap of its jaws, the coyote found a gap under the fence and scurried away into the deluge. Caleb stood for a moment, breathing heavily, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead and running in rivulets down his face. He turned to her, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Just a hungry opportunist." "You were so fast," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Have to be," he said, leaning the pitchfork against the coop. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, standing there soaked and shivering, her concern for him plain on her face. He stepped forward and, with a decisiveness that stunned her, took off his own heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of him. It enveloped her like an embrace. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice gruff, but the gesture betraying a deep well of care. He steered her back toward the cabin, his hand resting firmly on her back. The weight of his coat was a comfort, the heat of his hand a brand. That night, when the storm passed and they lay in their separate spaces in the shared bed, the distance between them felt infinitesimally small. The fear of Blackwood remained, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a new, warm, and terrifying hope for the future she was building with this quiet, steadfast man. The calm after the storm was short-lived. A few days later, a boy on a fast pony rode up from town with a notice. It was a formal announcement to be posted at the general store, but the boy had been paid to deliver copies to the outlying homesteads. Silas Blackwood himself was arriving in the territory in 1 week's time. He would be personally overseeing the final autumn roundup and settling all accounts for the season at his main camp, just a few miles north of their property. The paper felt like a death warrant in Alara's hand. An entire week, 7 days, until the most powerful man in the region was on their doorstep. His men would be scouring the plains for every last stray. There would be no place to hide button. The time for secrets was over. Caleb read the notice over her shoulder, his expression grim. "He's coming," he said, the words unnecessary. They both knew what it meant. The clock was no longer ticking. It was about to strike midnight. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken dread. They ate their meal in silence, the food tasteless in Alara's mouth. The problem sat between them, a solid, unmovable object. She could see the worry etched into every line on Caleb's face. She knew he was calculating the odds, weighing the risks, and finding no safe path forward. She was the one who had brought this upon them, and the guilt was a physical ache. After the dishes were cleared, she couldn't bear the silence any longer. "It's my fault, Caleb," she began, her voice trembling. "I was foolish. We should turn the calf loose. Tonight. Maybe they'll find it and assume it just wandered back." Caleb was staring into the fire, his hands resting on his knees. For a long time, he didn't answer. The firelight flickered across his rugged features, making him look older, wearier than she had ever seen him. "And what if they don't find it?" he asked finally, his voice low and gravelly. "What if the coyotes get it? After all your work?" He shook his head slowly. "No, that's not the answer." He turned to look at her, his gaze direct and piercing. "Hiding it now makes us thieves. Releasing it to die makes us fools. There's only one path left, Alara, the one that goes straight ahead." She didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "I mean we stop hiding," he said, his voice gaining a hard, resolute edge. "We stop acting like criminals. The day Blackwood opens his camp, we will be the first ones there. We'll load Button onto the wagon, and we will take him directly to Silas Blackwood. We will return his property, and you will tell him exactly what happened. The truth." The audacity of the plan stole her breath. Walk willingly into the lion's den? Confront the man everyone feared? "He'll never believe us," she whispered, horrified. "Jed will be there. He'll tell Blackwood we're liars and thieves. He'll have us arrested, or worse." "Let him try," Caleb said, and a fire she'd never seen before ignited in his eyes. It was the fire of a man who had been pushed too far, who had decided to stop yielding ground. "You did nothing wrong, Alara. You acted with compassion. If Silas Blackwood is half the man he's reputed to be, a hard man, but a fair one, he'll see that. And if he isn't, then I'd rather face him on my feet than be caught cowering in my own barn." He stood up and began to pace the small room, his energy filling the space. "This isn't just about a calf anymore. This is about us. It's about whether we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, afraid of our own shadows, living on the scraps he leaves us. I won't do it. My father bent to Blackwood, and it hollowed him out. I will not be broken." He stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming. "I will stand with you, Alara. We will do this together. But you have to be the one to speak. It's your story, your truth. I will not let them silence you." She looked up at him, at the unwavering resolve in his face, and felt her own fear begin to recede, replaced by a surge of his courage. He was offering her not just a plan, but his absolute faith. He was trusting her to be strong, empowering her to face down the greatest fear in their lives. He was treating her not as a liability to be protected, but as an equal partner to stand beside. It was the most profound declaration of commitment he could possibly have made. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude and a fierce, burgeoning love for this quiet man who possessed such a deep well of integrity. "All right," she said, her voice clear and steady. All right, Caleb, we'll face him together. The decision was made. A strange sense of calm settled over the homestead for the next few days. The fear was still there, a cold undercurrent, but it was now overlaid with purpose. They had a plan, a desperate and dangerous one, but it was their own. They were no longer reacting to the threat. They were marching out to meet it. They spent the week in preparation, their actions a silent testament to their unity. Caleb went over the wagon, checking the wheels and greasing the axles, ensuring it was sound for the journey. Alara carefully washed and mended their best clothes, her one simple church dress and his cleanest shirt. It felt like preparing for a funeral or a wedding, some momentous, life-altering occasion. She spent extra time with Button, brushing his coat until it shone and speaking to him in low, soothing tones as if explaining the journey to come. The calf was a proper little bull now, sturdy and bright-eyed, a living testament to her care. He was the evidence of her crime, but also the proof of her innocence. The night before they were set to leave, Caleb found her standing on the porch, looking out at the vast, dark land that would soon belong to Blackwood's camp. He came and stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. "Terrified," she admitted without hesitation. "But I'm not alone. That makes all the difference." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been alone for a long time," he confessed, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. "Since my mother died, and then my father, this land, it felt more like a prison than a home. Just a place of work and worry." He turned to her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her heart ache. "It doesn't feel like that anymore." Before she could respond, he reached out and took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm, his calloused palm engulfing her smaller hand. It was not the hesitant, fleeting touch of before, but a deliberate, possessive claiming. It was a promise, a vow spoken without words. They stood like that for a long time, hand in hand, two small figures braced against the vast emptiness, drawing strength from each other as they faced the dawn of the most important day of their lives. The morning arrived, cool and clear, the sky a pale, promising blue. The air was still, as if the world was holding its breath. They moved with a grim, focused efficiency. Caleb led the wagon to the barn, and together they coaxed a confused but trusting Button up a small ramp and into the back. Alara secured him with a soft rope, leaving him enough room to stand or lie down, and placed a bucket of water and a small pile of hay beside him. As Caleb hitched up their sturdy mare, Alara took one last look at their cabin. It was small, poor, and vulnerable, but it was their home. She sent a silent prayer into the morning air, a prayer for the quiet man checking the harness, for the innocent animal in the wagon, and for the fragile future they were risking everything to save. The journey was only a few miles, but it felt like crossing a continent. They left their own parched, struggling land and entered the domain of Silas Blackwood. The difference was immediate and stark. The grass was thicker, greener, nourished by the stream Blackwood had claimed years ago. The fences were strong and straight. The cattle they saw grazing were heavy and slick, their hides shining with health. It was a world of power and plenty. Soon they saw the camp. It was larger than they had imagined, a temporary city sprawled across a wide, flat plain. Dozens of wagons were arranged in a wide circle. Hundreds of horses stood tethered at picket lines. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and manure, and the lowing of a massive herd being held nearby. The sounds of men shouting, hammers ringing on an anvil, and the general hum of a large-scale operation washed over them, intimidating and immense. As they approached the perimeter, two riders detached themselves from the chaos and trotted toward them, blocking their path. One of them was the hawk-faced foreman, Jed. A smirk of triumphant malice spread across his face as his eyes fell on the calf in the back of their wagon. Well, Jed drawled, his voice dripping with false surprise. "Look what the cat dragged in, or what the thieves decided to return when they heard the master was home. I knew I smelled something rotten on your place, Miller." Caleb brought the wagon to a halt, his hands tightening on the reins, but his face remained a calm, unreadable mask. "We're here to see Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice steady. "We have business with him." "Oh, you have business with him, all right," Jed sneered. "The business of a thief and a rope." He turned to the other rider. "Go fetch the boss. Tell him we caught the rustlers he was warned about. Red-handed." The rider spurred his horse and galloped off toward a large tent set apart from the others. Jed dismounted and sauntered over to the wagon, peering at Button with a critical eye. "Have to admit, girlie," he said, directing his words at Alara, "you fattened him up nice. Almost ashamed to see him go to the slaughterhouse. The calf, I mean." Alara flinched but held her tongue, her promise to Caleb echoing in her mind. "It's your story, your truth." She lifted her chin, meeting Jed's cruel gaze without wavering. Caleb's presence beside her was a fortress wall. He didn't speak, but she could feel his silent, unwavering support. A few minutes later, a figure emerged from the large tent. Even from a distance, he commanded attention. Silas Blackwood was an old man, perhaps nearing 70, with a shock of white hair and a back that was still ramrod straight. He walked with a purpose that belied his age, followed by the rider Jed had sent. As he drew closer, Alara could see his face was a roadmap of a hard life lived under a harsh sun, his eyes a pale, piercing blue that seemed to miss nothing. He was not the monster of her imagination, but something far more formidable, a man of immense, quiet authority. He stopped before their wagon, his gaze sweeping over them, the tired horse, the shabby wagon, and finally the calf. His expression was impossible to read. Jed stepped forward eagerly, like a dog presenting a prize. "Here they are, Mr. Blackwood," Jed announced. "Just like I told you. Found on the edge of their property with your branded stock. Trying to build their own herd with your property." Blackwood didn't look at Jed. His sharp eyes were fixed on Caleb. "Is this true, Miller? You've been a neighbor for a long time. I didn't take you for a petty thief." Caleb met his gaze squarely. "It's true the calf is on my property, Mr. Blackwood, and it's true it bears your brand." He paused, then gestured toward Alara. "But it is my wife who has business with you. I ask that you hear her out." This was it, the moment of truth. Every man in the vicinity had stopped what he was doing and was now watching them, a silent, judgmental audience. Alara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she thought of Caleb's faith in her, of his hand in hers the night before, and found a reservoir of strength she didn't know she possessed. She slid down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. She stood before the most powerful man she had ever met, a small, plain woman in a faded dress, and began to speak. Her voice, though quiet, was clear and carried in the sudden stillness. "My name is Alara Miller, sir," she began. "A few weeks ago, one of your herds passed our land. The day after, I was mending a fence, and I found him." She gestured to Button. "He had been left behind. He was half dead. I couldn't just leave him there to be eaten by coyotes." She told him everything, about bringing the calf to the barn, about nursing it with their own goat's milk, about her fear and her determination. She didn't make excuses or plead for pity. She simply told the unadorned truth, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "I know it was your property, sir. I never intended to steal him. I only intended to save him. We came today to return him to you and to offer payment for the trouble. And for the milk," she looked him straight in the eye. "We don't have much, but we have a good milk cow. She's yours, if you'll accept her as payment." A heavy silence fell when she finished. Jed let out a derisive snort. "A likely story. She saw a free calf and took it. Now that she's caught, she spins a pretty tale." But Blackwood didn't seem to be listening to his foreman. His piercing gaze was fixed on Alara, studying her face with an unnerving intensity. He then walked slowly to the back of the wagon and looked at Button. He ran a practiced hand over the calf's flank, checked the clarity of his eyes, the strength of his legs. "This animal was near death, you say?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Yes, sir," Alara confirmed. He couldn't stand. His breathing was shallow. Blackwood turned his gaze from the calf to his foreman. "Jed, When you cull the weak from the herd, what do you look for? Jed, sensing a shift in the current, straightened up. Lack of vigor, sir. Can't keep up. Scrawny. Animals that are a drain, not an asset. And this calf, Blackwood said, his voice dangerously soft. It would have met that description. Yes, sir. Absolutely, Jed said confidently. It was a write-off. Not worth the effort. Blackwood nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on Jed. So you, my $30 a month foreman, with all the resources of my ranch at your disposal, decided this animal's life was not worth the effort. But this woman, he gestured to Alara, with a failing homestead and barely enough to feed herself and her husband, she decided it was. Jed's confident smirk faltered. He began to stammer. Well, sir, it's a matter of business, of numbers. Silence, Blackwood commanded, and the word cut through the air like a whip. He turned his back on Jed, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and addressed the crowd of silent, watching cowboys. You all see this? You see what laziness and a lack of pride in your work looks like? You would have let this animal, my property, rot in a ditch. This woman, with nothing, showed more stewardship and respect for my herd than the men I pay to protect it. He turned back to Alara, and the hardness in his face had softened into something else, something akin to wonder. You said your father taught you how to gentle animals with your heart, he said, and Alara started, realizing he must have overheard her conversation with Caleb in the barn that stormy night, or perhaps he just knew the truth of such things. He looked from her to Caleb. And you, Miller, you stood by your wife. You didn't hide. You brought this matter to me directly. You have more integrity in your little finger than this foreman has in his entire body. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the land around them. I'm an old man, he said, his voice now quieter, more reflective. I built this empire with my own 2 hands, alongside a wife who had the same fire in her belly that I see in you, missus. She could bring a half-dead lamb back from the brink with nothing but warm milk and stubbornness. She'd been gone 10 years. I have all this. He made a grand gesture at the camp, the herd, the endless land, but I have no one to pass the spirit of it on to. No one who understands that wealth isn't in the numbers, but in the grit it takes to build it, and the heart it takes to sustain it. He looked directly at Alara, a startling decision forming in his eyes. The calf is yours, girl, a gift, and so is your cow. You'll need her. He pointed to the south, toward their own small homestead. Your land borders my fallow section, 10,000 acres of it. It's been lying unused for years. It needs clearing. It needs a well. It needs a strong hand and a good heart. It needs a steward. It's yours. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Caleb and Alara stared at him, stunned into absolute silence. 10,000 acres. It was a kingdom. Jed, Blackwood barked, not looking at the now pale and trembling foreman. You're demoted. You'll be on fence duty at the northern range. Starting tomorrow, maybe a year of solitude will teach you the value of a single, breathing creature. He then turned to another of his men. Hitch up a team to this couple's wagon. Their mare looks tired. And find my lawyer. Tell him to draw up the deed for the Miller homestead. 10,000 acres, effective immediately. He stepped up to Alara, his expression one of deep, weary respect. Don't thank me, missus. You earned it. My wife would have liked you. With that, Silas Blackwood turned and walked back to his tent, leaving behind a sea of stunned faces and a quiet, impoverished couple who now owned a future they could never have dreamed of. The ride home was a dream. They sat side by side on the wagon seat, pulled by 2 of Blackwood's strong draft horses, their own tired mare tethered behind. Button, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift he had caused, chewed his hay contentedly. Neither Caleb nor Alara spoke. The words did not exist to contain the magnitude of what had just happened. 10,000 acres. The phrase repeated itself in Alara's mind until it lost all meaning, becoming a mere sound. When they reached the ridge that overlooked their small cabin, Caleb pulled the team to a halt. Below them lay their property, the small, weathered structure looking like a child's toy against the vastness of the plains. But now, when they looked beyond their sagging fences, The land that stretched toward the hazy blue mountains was no longer a symbol of another man's power. It was theirs. It was a landscape of raw, untamed possibility. It was their future waiting for them. The silence that had once been a barrier between them was now a vessel filled with shared awe and profound emotion. Caleb finally turned to her, his face a mixture of shock, relief, and a deep, quiet joy that made his eyes shine. "Alara," he said, and her name on his lips was a prayer. He didn't know what else to say. He simply reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. In that moment, standing on the edge of their new world, Alara was no longer the orphan girl who had agreed to a marriage of survival. She was a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her place. She had faced down fear and prejudice with simple, honest compassion, and in doing so, had unlocked a life beyond her wildest imaginings. The deed, the land, those were astonishing gifts. But the true prize was the man sitting beside her, whose quiet faith had given her the courage to claim them. They finally continued down to the cabin. News, they knew, would travel fast. Their standing in the community, their very identity, had been redrawn. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, there was only the quiet reality of their new life. They unhitched the horses and tended to the animals, moving together in a comfortable, practiced rhythm. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the endless sky in strokes of orange and violet, they stood on their small porch. Button, their small agent of fate, nuzzled against Alara's hand. Caleb came to stand behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. The gesture was no longer hesitant, but natural, proprietary, loving. The weight of his hands was an anchor in the dizzying sea of change. He looked out at the vast expanse of land that was now their responsibility, their legacy. Then he looked down at her, at the woman who had brought this miracle to their door with an act of stubborn kindness. He had worried about saving his small patch of dirt, and she, by saving one insignificant calf, had gifted them an entire world. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her hair, and whispered, for the first time with the full weight of his heart, "Thank you, Alara." She turned in the circle of his arms, her smile finally reaching her eyes, bright and clear and full of promise. She placed her hand over his on her shoulder, a silent seal on their new beginning. "We're home, Caleb," she whispered back. "We're finally home." Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.